Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Council on Black Health webinar entitled Last on the List, the Multiple Caregiver Role and Behavior Change for Weight Control Among Black Women. Today's presentation is part of the 2020-2021 webinar series offered by the Council's Solutions to Diabetes and Black Americans Core. This core is part of the NIH-funded Center for Diabetes Translation Research at the Washington University in St. Louis. The Solutions to Diabetes and Black Americans Core provides methodological and content expertise to advance the field of diabetes research in Black Americans. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. My name is Tiffany Eaton. I am a doctoral candidate and graduate research fellow at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University, where the council is based, currently working with Dr. Shariki Kumanyika, the founding chair of the council. I will be your moderator today. The Council's mission is to develop and promote solutions that achieve healthy Black communities. We leverage the credibility and perspectives of Black American researchers, other collaborators, and research partners to facilitate relevant, community-engaged, actionable solutions that positively impact Black communities. Today's webinar will discuss insights surrounding Black women's caregiving on dietary and physical activity behaviors and weight while pursuing weight loss, and also highlight potential directions for future efforts to address obesity and improve weight loss in treatment-seeking Black women. During the presentation, we ask that you post questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We will review and select questions for our presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion. If your question was not selected for response, we will share follow-up feedback after today's session. Please feel free to also use the chat window to interact with fellow attendees. Today's presentation will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will publish the webinar online and share that link via email. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Lanaki Blackman-Carr. Dr. Blackman-Carr is an assistant professor of community and public health nutrition, at the University of Connecticut. Her expertise is in behavioral weight control interventions and obesity health disparities. She develops and evaluates interventions that leverage social relationships to improve weight loss and related diet and physical activity behavior change. She has been a registered dietitian for over a decade and focuses much of her work on the health of Black women. Dr. Blackman-Carr, I now invite you to proceed.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that introduction. I'm very glad to be with you all today and look forward to answering some questions and having great dialogue at the end of this presentation. But for today, just to give you a sense of where we're headed, we'll start off just, of course, discussing the foundation of the conversation, which is talking about the connection between weight and diabetes in the present day. Of course, my research really focuses on Black women, and so we'll talk about the status of high weight in our community. We'll also talk about approaches to weight control that are applied in these modern times, but also challenges that befall those approaches as they connect with Black women and their outcomes. And also, of course, meat and potatoes of today is really talking about this multiple caregiver role and similar concepts and its effect in weight control approaches. And finally, I'll end with some future directions and insights that really talk about addressing multiple caregiver role, MCR, and how we might improve the health of Black women connected to weight and considering this context of multiple caregiving. So without further ado, let's continue and kick things off really talking about weight status and diabetes and how those two health states actually interact. And so what we know currently regarding type 2 diabetes, and that is a type of diabetes really connected with weight status, is that minority and populations really deal with the highest prevalence of diagnosed diabetes within the United States. So we can see here that among American Indians, Alaska Natives, individuals of Hispanic origin, and non-Hispanic Black adults, the rates of diabetes prevalence within these groups. And again, these are the highest representation of diagnosed diabetes type 2. But we know that high weight is a risk factor for diabetes. When we look at the National Diabetes Statistics Report released in 2020, we can see that 89% of diagnosed cases of type 2 diabetes have overweight or obesity. And within that, 77.1% of diagnosed individuals with type 2 diabetes are attempting to manage or lose weight as a way to control their disease and hopefully lessen their symptoms. And so these two states of being are certainly connected. And these next few maps really illustrate that by indicating the percentage of obesity and diabetes in the United States over several years. So we can see that as the colors darken, starting here in 2004, how both obesity and diabetes are really overlapping and impacting much of our nation. And often we hear the confluence of obesity and diabetes referred to as a twin epidemics because they are so connected. So there's really a strong rationale for focusing on weight as we're talking about type 2 diabetes. And as we dig a little deeper and look specifically at weight statistics, the most recent ones available, we can see that if we're looking at the left at the total column, that the prevalence of obesity is highest among non-Hispanic Black adults. This is men and women combined in the total area. But if we scan across this bar chart, and look at the gender breakdown, it becomes very clear that Black women are certainly bearing the brunt of the obesity epidemic. And so there's a real motivation here to focus on how do we develop effective approaches for weight control that are going to be effective for Black women. And so with that in mind, I want to give you just a sense of where we've been when it comes to how we approach weight. And given the statistics of weight within the United States, particularly for Black women, but really for all adults dealing with high weight, standard behavioral weight control has been go-to for lifestyle change. And the diabetes prevention program was really one of the seminal trials that indicated lifestyle treatment was effective and has been a foundation for much of what came after up until this day. And so the diabetes prevention program was a multi-center and randomized trial that, in essence, and this is in a real quick snapshot, but I encourage folks, if they're interested, to dig back and look for their paper describing their intervention approach. But the DPP really compared lifestyle treatment versus metformin treatment on diabetes incidence. And the goal within diabetes prevention program, specifically within the lifestyle treatment arm, was 7% weight loss. And so that was a goal, along with some other goals for physical activity as well. But the outcomes that we observed from this trial, which was intensive in treatment, had a diverse sample, and was quite effective, and really, again, drove home the point that lifestyle treatment, changing dietary, physical activity habits, and behaviors related to that could produce weight loss, but also resulted importantly in a 58% reduction in the incidence of type 2 diabetes. So it was very effective, the lifestyle treatment. And that was significantly different than the reduction of type 2 diabetes incidence that came from the metformin treatment, which was 31%. But all in all, I highlight the diabetes prevention program because, again, it has been a foundation for standard behavioral treatment since these results were published and that intervention concluded. So much of what we do today is really rooted in the lifestyle approaches of the diabetes prevention program. And so standard behavioral treatment to this day, as these icons indicate, really focusing on dietary intake and reducing caloric intake. Combining that with behavior change and engagement in physical activity, and then also combining that with behavioral strategies such as goal setting and many others to ultimately produce 5 to 10% weight loss over even in the short term, 6 months. But for some, of course, that can take longer. But this is the basic formula for standard behavioral weight loss, which when we're dealing with high weight, particularly those living with obesity, is really where we focus as a public health approach. And so achieving that 5 to 10% weight reduction from where an individual may start has been shown to reduce and provide clinical health benefits. And so that is why that target exists. However, what we have also seen over these decades of weight loss focus and approaches is that, yes, standard behavioral treatment is effective in the lifestyle change that it can produce. So it is efficacious. In our best settings, we know that significant weight loss can be achieved. However, what we are lacking at this point in time are really solutions that are effective for Black women. What we commonly see is that there are small, maybe even modest amounts of weight loss among this subgroup. And that can often total or look like 2 to 3 kilograms of weight loss, or 2 to 3% of weight loss is what you'll see if you look across the literature. And so obviously that is below our 5 to 10% goal of weight reduction from that baseline starting weight, which is the threshold for clinical significance. So truly the goal, of course, is to produce a standard behavioral treatment for weight loss that will confer this clinical benefit and helping and facilitating Black women achieving those outcomes as other groups do in these treatments. We do know, and there are some shining spots, that some treatments do show better outcomes in terms of increased or higher weight loss among Black women. And acceptance-based behavioral treatment is one such approach that really focuses on building some of the psychological tools to work around what an individual cannot control. So we've seen some improvements in treatment with that. However, if we did make any kind of racial comparison, perhaps between Black and white women, you will still see, even in acceptance-based behavioral treatment, that there are significantly different weight losses between Black and white women. However, without even making that racial comparison, typically we do see that small amount of weight, 2 to 3 kilograms or 2 to 3%, as a common outcome from weight loss interventions. So what are some potential factors that can underlie why the weight loss for Black women tends to be less, or at least not hitting our clinical markers for better health outcomes? One potential factor is, pretty well known, and we really can say it can be a lack of information. So when we're looking at the literature, by and large, often we can come across just a lack of disaggregating the data and discussing outcomes by race and gender. So that is a really big factor that's been indicated in the literature as something that is preventing us from really understanding the behavior change processes and the outcomes, and perhaps other variables that might influence why Black women's weight loss in standard behavioral treatment. But also, and I think this is just a challenge throughout clinical research, and underrepresentation still exists. There are certainly many studies that have recruited Black women at or above the population level. However, underrepresentation does continue to be a challenge, again, in us understanding what can work for a particular group, in this case, Black women. But importantly, and what I believe is missing and really influences some of my work today, is the lack of contextual understanding for Black women's lived experience. So while these standard behavioral treatments do have a target for dietary and physical activity change, we really have not considered, as much as we could and intervened on, the context surrounding when and how those behaviors are adopted and actually practiced. And so there's much work to be done, especially with an approach that does focus at least to date, on individual level treatment. And so again, without knowing the context of how the behavior changes that standard behavioral weight loss aims to improve upon to result in weight loss, we really aren't sure about how different factors can impact the behavior change process and ultimately the outcomes. Now, one such, I'll say, model or paradigm that does help us understand the role of context and how it might impact individuals and subgroups change processes are the expanded knowledge domains, which come from the expanded obesity research paradigm made by the African American Collaborative for Obesity Research Network, the former name of the Council on Black Health. And so from that overall research model or network, these expanded knowledge domains really situate energy balance, or our intake and output of energy or calories, if you want to think of it in a very simple form, and how that's really influenced by these three domains. So the one I'm focusing on today are the cultural and psychosocial processes of behaviors and how we actually achieve that energy balance, or in this case, we really want to facilitate an energy deficit, which will beget weight loss. And so in thinking about that cultural and psychosocial processes, within that domain, we're really talking about how communities are organized to make decisions, what is really the role of Black women in the community, and even considering things such as within race diversity. And we know that the Black community is not a monolith. We hail from many different nationalities, even within the United States, and different lengths that we might have been here if we're coming from immigrant communities as well. But there is much that diversifies the Black community that perhaps hasn't been considered yet. But where I'm choosing to focus really is on the role of Black women, because we have this intersection of identities. Their race, of course, being Black within the United States and the context that can imply, and then also their gender. And there are certainly gender, social, and cultural norms that are at play here. So Black women really sit at the center of these two identities, and exploring that more might give us some insight into how the weight loss process occurs. And so the multiple caregiver role is really central to Black women's lives, because it is that confluence of their race and their gender, their different roles defined by those two identities. And so the multiple caregiver role is really characterized by the provision of emotional support to family and friends. So not just your family, but also your extended family network. Also, that provision of tangible support is important and a part of this multiple caregiver role, which can really levy some heavy pressure on women to be there for everyone and doing it all. But certainly, because this is a normative role within the Black community, there's an expectation of support. And in this role, and you can certainly reference this paper by Carmen Samuel Hodge, published in 2000, really discusses this role more in depth from a qualitative perspective, but does discuss this expectation of support that comes from parents and even grandparents in the family context. But it can really interfere with self-care behaviors, which is very important, of course, for the conversation we're having, but it's important because this particular concept, and as referenced in this paper, is done or was collected in a sample of African Americans with type 2 diabetes. So that is definitely helpful here, that tool also had relevance for studying it in a weight loss context. But there's also a cultural and personal expectation to perform this role on the part of Black women. So it is deeply ingrained within our sociocultural aspects of the Black community. And so What I did a few years ago is conduct a behavioral weight loss study, really comparing two approaches, that standard behavioral treatment that we've already reviewed, but comparing that to standard behavioral treatment plus a physical activity barrier reduction component that was specific to the barriers Black women really encounter when it comes to engaging in physical activity, because there's some evidence that with greater levels of physical activity, it might actually bump up that small amount of weight loss we commonly see to reach that clinical goal of 5 to 10% weight loss. And so in that study, it was 6 months long, which is considered short term and conducted face to face. And so this study called Sisters in Health took place in North Carolina. And I'm very thankful, of course, to all the participants who participated and really gave robust data to enable me to do this work and explore more how we can build more effective solutions for Black women. But very briefly, the outcomes for this study were really no different than what we see in the larger literature. So we could consider this null results if you would like, but we can also learn from this, which sometimes maybe we don't do enough of as a field. But the weight loss overall, if we were to combine women across groups, was significantly lower from when they started. So we can see that in that standard behavioral group, they lost about 2.83 kilograms. And in that enhanced barrier reduction arm, they lost just a tiny bit more than 2 kilograms. But again, this really replicates the typical reduction of weight that we see in the weight loss evidence base. And so with that in mind, and moving into this secondary data analysis to look at the multiple caregiver role, there's really no difference between these groups' weight loss significantly, but also at baseline, there's no difference in their scores when it came to responding to the multiple caregiver instrument. So I collapsed data across groups to really see how that multiple caregiver role at baseline impacted the behavior changes that were targeted and even the weight loss that came at the end. And so just to give you some background on that tool, because I think it's always helpful to see, what was asked and what does it mean. But the instrument really had two subscales that gave us insight into Black women's role when it comes to caregiving. So one of the subscales spoke to the identification with the multiple caregiver role. So it's really describing their justification for assuming the role and their identification, how much they really felt like, okay, this is a role that I play in real life. And certainly we can assume across Black women that individuals might vary in terms of their identification with the role. But this tool, this multiple caregiver instrument, also described and captured multiple caregiver barriers. So really the negative perceptions or experience that women might feel in performing the multiple caregiver role. And so you can see here to the right, the different items on the tool, and the response options were a 4-point Likert scale from disagree a lot to agree a lot to these various items. And so that is the tool and its two subscales. So you see them here on out denoted as MCR for the role and MCB for barriers perception. And the women in this study, and our sample size was 81 for this secondary analysis, were in midlife, so on average about 48 years old, and came into the study with a body mass index of about 36 kilograms per meter squared. And we can see the multiple caregiver role score and barrier score here as well. And the highest score that was possible for the role was 24, and for the multiple caregiver barrier, 12. And so results of the secondary analysis, and I'm just highlighting the significant outcomes here, where as we look at the multiple caregiver role, we can see that attendance was significantly lower the more women identified with the multiple caregiver role. And we'll talk about why that's important. So that's attendance to the intervention sessions, of which there were 18 over the span of 6 months. Secondly, we can see if we scan across to the multiple caregiver barrier column that there was also a significantly lower change in their fruit and vegetable intake over the 6-month study. The more women found or identified that there were barriers connected to their caregiving. So again, dietary change is central to weight loss. So we'll dig more into that momentarily. And then finally, there is a marginally significant change in weight. And in this case, of course, we're aiming for weight loss, but we can see that there was a weight gain that was marginally significant the more women identified with the multiple caregiver role. And so this is very, very interesting and compelling given the targets and the ultimate goal of behavioral treatment for weight loss. And so talking more about those three most interesting and significant outcomes from this analysis was looking at attendance in the multiple caregiver role that dose received. As attendance wanes or is lower, participants are not receiving the intended dose delivered of the intervention. And so that diminished just impact certainly has a potential connection to weight loss. So we know that the more attendance of intervention sessions that occurs, that's associated with greater weight loss. And in this case, we see that attendance was actually diminished. And so that may actually connect to some of the weight change or weight gain that was marginally significant that we saw. And that is a concerning trend. But again, that was marginally significant. So perhaps there's more work to do there to really tease that out. And then finally, in regards to the dietary changes that were reduced as I guess you can say, a connection to the multiple caregiver barrier, really this is important because fruits and vegetables, of course, are promoted. They're a lower calorie, high nutrient density category of foods, and they're not the only foods that are promoted, but they are important for lowering that caloric intake as they become substitutes for perhaps higher calorie foods in the diet of someone who is making a change to support weight loss. And so this is certainly something that is piques my interest as a dietitian. But when we're also thinking about diabetes management, much of the same dietary advice really does connect with weight loss as well. And thinking about the multiple caregiver role and the perceived barriers that women might feel from it and actually feel its burden, is that it's really a double-edged sword, if you will. This multiple caregiver role has positive attributes. It is a valued sociocultural role in the Black community. And so women willingly step into this role. We can even discuss more maybe in the Q&A how this is kind of a passed down hat that Black women wear. But of course, the other end of that is that it can be burdensome. So the negative impacts of that is that it can also yield stress and fatigue, both physical and mental, is what's been spelled out in the literature. So we have to be mindful moving forward. How do we actually deal with this in a responsible way as individuals who collectively focus on the health of Black Americans and Black women in particular? And there are many similar concepts throughout the literature that can help us understand why and how we might move to the next steps and future solutions when it comes to the multiple caregiver role, specifically in the context of weight loss, which of course controlling weight helps us also control type 2 diabetes. But similar concepts you all listening may have heard of include the superwoman schema, the strong Black woman syndrome, and the superwoman role. And I'm sure there are other variations of these names, but these are similar concepts that characterize really Black women's disengagement from self-care because of all of the care that is given to others. Certainly characterized by this, doing it all or having to do it all or be everything. And, being last on that list or not on the list at all. And in the midst of doing it all, having to be quite stoic, at a high level, and showing emotional invulnerability and many other traits that are part of the similar concepts relating to multiple caregiver role. But again, this is a cultural and social expectation that is, in some literature, been referred to as handed down generationally between Black women to daughters and nieces and so on and so forth. But that part of this caregiving it certainly is, as I mentioned before, that mental and physical fatigue from giving it all to others and not necessarily oneself. That can certainly yield stress, including emotional and binge eating as well. So some disordered eating habits have been reported from this as well. And physical inactivity. And physical activity certainly is part of the target of standard behavioral weight loss and even for weight gain prevention, engaging in physical activity is important. So when we see across these similar concepts, these different impacts, it is certainly far and wide how this can impact Black women's uptake and adoption and even engagement in behavioral weight loss processes and everything that's being asked of them during that time. So to give a few insights here on just where do we go, really we need to focus in part on higher level factors, perhaps before we dive into weight loss itself. So the multiple caregiver role, superwoman role, strong Black woman role, that is really born out of inequitable systems and contexts. So really thinking about economic contexts and burdens, structural racism and how that shapes our built environment, but also how Black women might move through any given day and what they experience, but also sexism, excuse me, and the gendered roles that women assume or are assumed for them are something that we might need to focus on before we get to talking about individual level weight loss. So that is certainly important, taking that focus on higher level factors and in part measuring those things. So even as we're conducting weight loss interventions, when we can capture racism, when we can capture the different facets of economic life stability, whether it's beyond just income, maybe even wealth and assets, are things to consider so we can see how all of that connects to Black women's lives and ability to then focus on these individual level changes. But we also need to work with the role. As I mentioned, it is certainly a double-edged sword born out of necessity, given allowed and facilitated Black women's survival and thriving, and not just Black women's survival and thriving, but also that of their communities because of all this energy and effort, which so simply stated is provided to their family context. And we know in the Black community, family is not just blood, it's your community. So working with this role, we have to talk about how we responsibly do that and modify support, not to eliminate Black women actually providing that support, but really think about how can it be done in a way that doesn't take so much from Black women and enables them to engage in self-care. And then also, how do we prevent ourselves, especially as researchers who of course want to provide solutions, how do we facilitate not adding more to Black women's plates? Because their plates are full, our plates are full. And so social support is certainly something that is an area of interest in terms of interventions, but how do we make that happen without asking Black women to do more themselves? So I think there's some nuance there as we move to thinking about social relationships and the support that could be provided to Black women without also facilitating an expectation that they also reciprocate that support because they're already doing it. And so I really enjoy this quote from a chapter in Doing Nutrition Differently, Critical Approaches to Diet and Dietary Intervention. And it reads, nutrition discussions that approach Black women's overweight as fundamentally about portion size and the healthfulness of food choices are at best a superficial reflection of the appetites Black women have and that are routinely denied in their everyday interactions at home, in their communities, and in the public sphere. Black women hunger for support, assistance, and loads not so burdensome. In essence, our plates are full. So how do we, with all of that in mind, and move forward in a responsible way? And while this quote really speaks to just the dietary aspect, I think it also is relevant as we're talking about the other behavior change processes that occur within weight loss interventions. So this certainly, we need to think about how can that support, that assistance, how can loads not be so burdensome to also assist Black women in engaging in more physical activity? How can we, allow them and make it more possible to work around and potentially even avoid some of those disordered eating habits, such as emotional and binge eating in response to the load of multiple caregiving and performing that superwoman role? How do we make that more possible? And so with that, I say thank you. I know we're a little bit early, but hopefully that just opens the door for more discussion and reflection. And I invite anybody to take down my email address and feel free to email me. But also, I love Twitter, so please feel free to engage with me there as well. I welcome your thoughts and welcome this discussion. And so I'll turn it over to our moderator, Tiffany, to take it from here and start fielding some of the questions and comments that we've received.
Yes, thank you. So yes, we would now like to invite our participants to post questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We do have some questions that have come in already. So while we wait for others to post theirs, I'll just start asking some of those. So one attendee asks, and they weren't sure if this was mentioned, but wonders if these women were also breadwinners, so like in a woman-headed household. And also, did the caregiving roles come up in the intervention sessions?
Okay, excellent question. So I did not collect data on women's place in the household, if you will, if they consider themselves a breadwinner, head of household or not. So I can't speak to that given just the absence of data for that item. But I will say the caregiving didn't necessarily come up in sessions per se, but from, I guess I would say, anecdotal observations and interactions before or after sessions with women, it definitely became clear that many of them, especially the ones who are grandmothers, were also providing childcare for their grandchildren, or still actually had to take care of their aging and elderly parents. So I saw that repeated, again, casually throughout my intervention, as I had mentioned, particularly for the women who were older and might have been retired. They were definitely also providing a lot of caregiving as well.
Thank you for that. And just to follow up on that question, did you notice any differences in some of the barriers that were given by participants connected to the type of caregiver they were, whether they were caring for children, grandchildren, or for elderly adults?
Children, grandchildren, elderly adults. I will say, when participants had an absence, they would mention, why they were absent. And certainly caregiving did come up for that many a time. And it was across the board, whether that was caregiving for parents or helping out their adult children with their grandchildren, that certainly came up. And I do recall, instances where younger women in the study, as we saw the about 48 years old was the average age of women within the study. So younger women didn't necessarily continue with the study once they kind of saw the demand. This was again in person, starting out weekly and reducing to biweekly after 3 months, but totaling in 18 sessions. But the childcare needs of younger women with young families certainly made them feel like, okay, this, I can't really commit to this right now. I'm giving my own caregiving to my family, and there's no space for this, type of self-care now. So that did come up, during the recruitment and eligibility screening process.
That's interesting, in assessing the role of the caregiver and just how sometimes the caregiving role is prohibiting participation in certain for certain people. But I did also, to follow up on that, did you notice any barriers or similarities or differences in barriers based on SES? I know you separated by two different groups.
So no, I didn't notice any different barriers per se. I really collapsed across the groups to bring them together because initially really didn't see any difference in their scores indicating how much they identified with the multiple caregiver role itself or with the barriers. So did not look for, because we just didn't have that initial indication to dig deeper, that there were differences in that regard.
Great. So we do have another question. Does the multiple caregiver role instrument specifically query food-related roles? And could greater identification with the food-related roles relate to the weight gain finding?
Mm. Very good question. So the instrument does not specifically query food-related roles, and kind of the underlying assumption there is that women do provide a lot of the food-related duties of the household, whether it's the procurement of food or the cooking, preparation of food. I do think a future study, and this is where it would really be helpful to have a larger sample so that we could collect, I'll say, potentially mediating data that would allow us to conduct mediation analyses, would be to focus on that dietary aspect. I would certainly love to see more about that multiple caregiver role and food ways as well, but that didn't come out and wasn't part of the instrument that we use. But I do think it would be very interesting to see more of that. And this is where I'll make a shameless plug for qualitative research, because that really was what allowed the multiple caregiving instrument to develop, was its roots in qualitative investigation. And I think a lot of what we might need to know moving forward will be best learned with qualitative approaches or even mixed methods approaches. But I think there's a lot of space for developing more tools that will allow us to understand the context of Black women's lives. Because right now, when we look and think about, why are these results in terms of weight loss not as robust for Black women, the tools just aren't always there for us to ask and then answer the research questions that come up after a study like this.
Right. And so just a question of clarification, you may have touched on this, so apologies if you have to repeat. But one of your slides mentioned barrier reduction. And so I was sort of interested in what sorts of barrier reduction strategies that you implemented or were addressing.
Certainly. I really quickly went over that. So I encourage folks to check out Google Scholar, and I believe that's my 2019 paper, so Blackman Carr 2019, talking about comparative effectiveness of two approaches to weight loss for Black women. So the arm that included barrier reduction approaches for physical activity really focused on, you can call it the kitchen sink approach. In hindsight being 2020, I think we could have been more nuanced, or I could have been more nuanced in how we went after these barriers. But basically, it's tackling areas that are not often addressed in weight loss studies that are pertinent to Black women's physical activity development, or could be a barrier to that. So for instance, sweating out our hair, which can be seen as, I think in the general public, as not that important, but I believe there was an article several years ago by, I believe her name is Michelle Hall, that does discuss in her sample about 40% of women um, in her sample avoided physical activity due to hair concerns, and that's Black women. And so that's just one example of a barrier that we attempted to address largely through a team-based approach where women were assigned to small groups to problem solve and goal set around barriers such as that. Another barrier would have been really that pushback from family. So how do you handle it when you're losing weight, but it can be seen as not a positive thing by your family, which is another thing that came out casually among some of my participants. And so, again, through that goal setting, problem solving, team-based approach, tried to work on that. So, and then another barrier includes just lack of physical activity role models. It's not really seen as a normative behavior often for women who might not be engaged in physical activity at the moment. And so we incorporated exercise ambassadors, which were other Black women from the local community who had successfully lost weight and maintained it, attaching and mapping on their experience of how they overcame hair as a barrier, how they navigated the familial pushback of the woman now needing to focus on herself and her body changing and losing weight, but how they were able to stay the course and work with or work around some of these barriers to continue on their weight loss trajectory. And so there were myriad elements that were part of that barrier reduction. And then I should mention, provided space and time for 30 minutes of physical activity in that barrier reduction group, who also did receive that standard behavioral treatment too, but they had active time to practice and rehearse physical activity within session before they would try it out on their own in between the intervention meetings.
Well, thank you for expanding on that. Thank you for and clarifying. Just again, attendees, if you do have questions, please post them using the Q&A, excuse me, webinar button. But also, if you want to post in the chat, that's fine as well. We do have some more questions. One attendee says, excellent presentation, and thank you so much for sharing this work. They're curious about how much variation in Black women's perceptions of their own MCR and how this might impact the effectiveness of these behavioral treatment for weight loss. And how could these differences influence how we incorporate the MCR into future weight loss efforts?
Ooh, this is a good question because it really it's exactly what I'm thinking moving forward. And thank you for the compliment, whoever submitted that question. So I think this is part of where we need to go in the future. We, of course, know that Black women, the Black community is not a monolith, and I expect that identification with the multiple caregiver role and its associated barriers is going to vary across Black women. We did not look at the variation within our sample, and I think we might need a larger sample to really do that well. But where I think we might need to head in the future is really how we personalize interventions to be responsive to these differing elements of any individual. And in this case with Black women, how much they may or may not identify as a multiple caregiver. So I believe that perhaps by how their families look, how many people may they actually be caring for is going to inform and their experience as a multiple caregiver and whether or not it's actually a barrier. And so I think approaches to perhaps tailor on their individual level of identification with the role and its barriers is going to be important. And who knows, maybe even digital approaches to that could be important, just knowing where we're going as a field and what technology has allowed us to do to date. I think there are a lot of exciting pathways we can take, but yes, I expect that there is variability and everyone might not ascribe to the multiple caregiver role just depending on where they are in their own health practices. So we will need to be mindful of that as investigators moving forward, that a blanket approach may not work. and perhaps we can do more formative research in that area to tease that out before investing the time and effort to actually create those more personalized or tailored approaches.
Right. And I think that is the key. And so Shriki did post a question in the chat to Yulaniki. I'll read it, but also to other attendees. So other attendees, feel free to post your response in the chat box. But the question is, what are some ideas for how to address the caregiving issues and the broader contextual factors?
Okay. How to address the caregiving issues. My goodness, I feel like that is the question. So thank you, Shariki, for that deep question, which I think has a well of knowledge that we need to uncover there. So how do we really deal with it? Well, I think first and foremost, as we've seen in the past with research, we need not demonize the multiple caregiver role, because we know that it does have positive attributes, and has allowed Black women to thrive in some ways, but also has its detriments. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, is what I'm saying. And so we need to ask Black women who are identifying with this role, perhaps at different levels, and maybe those who have come away from or navigated successfully their weight loss, or other dietary, physical activity, behavior change, how they navigated around the multiple caregiver role. So I think a lot of the forward movement we need to make in research is understanding, okay, well, how can we balance this strength and caregiving that is a positive to communities and families without the detrimental impact. And so when I think of this, I think of, well, how does social support actually play out? And often we're talking about reciprocity in social support. So teaching someone to give it, but also I think also perhaps thinking about how do people receive it. And I think that might be the other challenging part. So I think in the social support arena, that is something we're going to have to contend with. But it's, how do we not ask Black women to do more? How do we actually facilitate their support? So perhaps taking a familial focus on interventions is the way we make that happen, since the caregiving is really to the family and the friend networks. So it can't just be necessarily as the woman herself as the lone target of an intervention. Perhaps we actually need to draw in family. And so this is certainly a community-wide concept that I think will necessitate community-wide input and perhaps integration. But the second part of that question was, how do we really deal with the higher level influences that made Superwoman Schema, multiple caregiver role, these concepts that are very similar come to be? And I think that's where we really need to focus on multi-level interventions. So perhaps before we think about this behavior change on an individual level, we actually need to target, well, how do we improve economic situations? How do we improve, political power on a local basis? And think about that communities thriving in that way, because all of that might facilitate perhaps lower stress, lower worry when you have more resources. So let's focus on what's missing in what surrounds Black women in terms of resources as well. And then maybe we'll actually have time and space to put importance on those individual level behaviors when we're not dealing with these higher level ecological forces that really impact how we move through each day and experience our world. So I think that's largely where we need to go. And so systems approaches, and that's not really quite my area, but I know that is a robust area of research, will be something to focus on. And again, multi-level interventions, and very basically, let's make sure we're measuring those things. So even if we are an individual level focused researcher, are we capturing data on the built environment, what is actually surrounding our participants? So again, we can produce the data that continues to tell us how the context impacts their individual behaviors the intervention might targeting, even if what you have now is an intervention that won't focus on changing higher level factors. So that's a very long answer, but thank you for that, Shariki.
It was a very long answer, but it was very thoughtful and very informative in terms of next steps and strategies. So thank you for that. I just wanted to check the chat, make sure I didn't miss any questions, and I don't think that I have. And I do, want to thank you, Dr. Blackman-Carr, for your insightful presentation and for sharing your work, on the multiple caregiver role and its influence on behavior change for weight control among Black women. This presentation was very informative, and just again, thank you. On behalf of the Council on Black Health and the Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans Core, I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We will be sharing an evaluation survey for this webinar shortly. I want to tell everyone have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the rest of your summer. Take care, everyone.